In the gleaming boardroom of Venturon Capital, a seasoned executive was about to face the ultimate corporate betrayal. What started as a routine post-deal meeting took a shocking turn when they came face-to-face with systematic humiliation disguised as restructuring. Sarah Jensen wasn't your typical corporate strategist. For 15 years, she had spent her life building Venturon from a mid-tier firm into a global powerhouse, known for her ability to close impossible deals and navigate the most complex international mergers. When she encountered Charles Bennett's calculated demotion after delivering the company's largest acquisition in history, she had no idea she was walking into a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate her as a threat. Sarah's quiet acceptance of her new role as executive coordinator would lead to consequences that would shake the entire financial district. What began as professional humiliation would become a masterclass in strategic patience. The corporate world would never be the same after Sarah Jensen proved that true power doesn't come from titles. It comes from building something so excellent that the very people who tried to destroy you end up begging for your expertise. The silence of her revolution would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I hadn't even changed my clothes. My suitcase was still in the car when the email came through. Please come to my office at your earliest convenience. No subject, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of what had just happened. I had just landed after a 72-hour whirlwind across 3 continents, Tokyo, Zurich, London, with one mission: secure the $3 billion merger deal Venturon Capital had been chasing for 3 years. And I did it. The largest acquisition in our company's history, signed, sealed, and ready to execute. 10 years of guaranteed revenue streams across 4 industries, positioning us as the dominant force in international M&A. But Charles Bennett didn't ask how the meeting went. He didn't ask if I had slept. He gestured toward the chair across from him, eyes glued to the folder in front of him like it might bite. "Sarah," he began, voice flat. "Effective immediately, we're restructuring your role and compensation." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "We're moving you into a more streamlined support capacity. Executive coordinator to strategic operations." Support. I built strategic operations. "And your salary will reflect the adjusted scope, a 60% reduction." It didn't feel real. My body registered the words before my brain could. My throat tightened. My skin burned. But I said nothing. On his desk, 2 papers were already printed. One labeled Revised Compensation Agreement, the other Role Reassignment Confirmation. No room for negotiation, no blank lines for feedback, just 2 places for my signature. He slid a pen across the desk without looking up. "Your new supervisor will be Aiden. I believe you met him last week." Aiden Bennett, his nephew, 27, fresh MBA, 0 field experience. The one who asked me where the coffee filters were during orientation. I nodded once, stood up, collected the papers. I don't even remember walking out, but I do remember the silence in the hallway as I passed the boardroom. I remember the smell of stale coffee and success I could no longer claim. And I remember one thought, cold and clear, cutting through the sting. They didn't demote me because I failed. They demoted me because I succeeded without their permission. That was the moment. Something broke and something else began. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt infinite. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman I barely recognized. Rumpled blazer, circles under her eyes, holding termination papers disguised as restructuring documents. 3 days ago, I was Sarah Jensen, Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions. Now I was Sarah Jensen, Executive Coordinator, reporting to a kid who couldn't find the coffee machine. I sat in my car for 20 minutes staring at the papers. The numbers were stark, brutal in their simplicity. My salary cut from $185,000 to $74,000. My benefits reduced to basic coverage. My office, my team, my authority, gone. My phone buzzed. A text from Michelle, my lead analyst. Heard the news. Coffee tomorrow? Word travels fast in corporate towers. By now, everyone knew. Sarah Jensen, the woman who just landed the biggest deal in company history, had been quietly dismantled. I started the engine and drove home in silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the merger documents spread out like tarot cards, searching for answers in the fine print. Every clause, every contingency, every protection, I had negotiated to safeguard Venturon's interests, and there it was, buried in subsection 7. 3. The success fees, the performance bonuses, the recognition structures that would have made me untouchable. Charles had signed off on all of it. 3 weeks ago, when success seemed uncertain, he was happy to promise me the world. Now that I'd delivered, those promises had become threats to his control. I pulled out my laptop and began typing. Not a resignation letter, not a complaint to HR. Something else entirely. A list. Assets I control. Relationships I've built. Knowledge they can't take away. Leverage they don't know I have. The list grew longer as the night wore on. Client contacts who trusted me personally. Deal structures only I understood. Market intelligence I'd gathered. Over 15 years of building Venturon from a mid-tier firm into a global powerhouse. They thought they were cutting me down. Instead, they'd just set me free. They didn't give me time to adjust. The morning after I signed the papers, I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m. sharp, like I always did. My old keycard still worked, but everything else had changed. My name was no longer on the 4th-floor glass door. The desk I had occupied for 8 years was already cleared, a fresh nameplate installed. Charles Bennett, VP Strategic Operations. I didn't ask questions. I didn't cause a scene. Instead, intern, someone I'd never seen before, silently led me to my new workspace. A cramped desk wedged between the break room and the office photocopier. No windows, no privacy, just the mechanical hum of a printer that jammed every other hour. There was no announcement about my new role, no handoff email, no thank you for your years of service. Just silence and eyes that refused to meet mine. That afternoon, I received a calendar invite. Strategy Review Prep. Internal, 2 hours p.m. Boardroom A. No agenda, no context. Still, I went. Old habits die hard. When I walked in, the room hushed like someone had spilled something. Aiden stood at the front by the projector screen, fumbling with slides. The rest of the team, my team, sat in awkward silence, avoiding my gaze. "Sarah?" Aiden said, flustered. "Could you, grab a fresh pot of coffee from the kitchen?" For a second, I thought he was joking. Then I looked around. No one laughed. No one defended me. No one even looked up. I nodded and walked out. My palms were shaking by the time I reached the coffee station. I gripped the pot like it might anchor me to the floor. I wasn't angry yet. Not exactly. It was something worse, something raw. Shame that prickled at the back of my throat. A quiet burn in the pit of my chest. Like I had been erased and left to serve the people who used to report to me. When I returned, Aiden was mid-presentation. "Our new strategic roadmap," he announced, "was built in close collaboration with our senior leadership." He clicked to the next slide. I froze. It was my deck, my framework, my language, word for word, even the color coding. The only thing missing was my name. It wasn't plagiarism, not technically. I had written it on company servers, using company time, but it felt like watching someone steal your voice and play it back to a crowd who pretended they didn't recognize it. Nobody said a word. The room nodded along like Aiden had birthed the idea himself. I placed the coffee pot on the table and sat in the back. No one made space. No one thanked me. In that moment, I realized something brutal. They hadn't just replaced me. They wanted me to serve the version of myself they found easier to control. The next week, I started eating lunch alone. No one said it, but it was understood. I was radioactive now. Colleagues who once came to me for guidance suddenly discovered they were too busy. Elevators became silent. Conversations stopped the second I walked by. In a building full of noise, my world had gone very, very quiet. So I took my lunch to the back staircase. It was peaceful there. Stale air, humming pipes, and solitude. I climbed slowly, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup I hadn't thrown away just yet. That's when I noticed something odd. The elevator panel lit up. 10th floor. Then nothing. No ding, no movement, just silence. I kept climbing. When I reached the landing between the 9th and 10th floors, I saw it. A dusty for lease sign taped behind smudged glass panels. The plaque beside the door simply read, Level 10, available for immediate occupancy. The logo underneath had faded, likely some startup that hadn't survived the pandemic. I stared at it for a long time, and then I smiled. Not a wide smile, just the kind that hides behind the lips. Sharp, restrained, but very, very real. The next day, I returned to the same staircase, this time with a sandwich and a question. At exactly 12:15 p.m., I walked through the front lobby instead of using my employee badge and asked to speak to the building manager. I introduced myself as a representative helping a boutique firm scout quiet private office space. The receptionist nodded. A few minutes later, Thomas, late 50s, worn blazer, clipboard in hand, greeted me. "I'm Thomas Renair, facilities director for the property," he said. "So you're looking on behalf of a client?" "Yes," I replied casually. "A small advisory firm. Looking for long-term stability, some privacy, and potential expansion flexibility." He raised an eyebrow. "That's exactly what we need right now. Since COVID, we've had to shift how we lease, actually." He leaned in slightly, voice lowered. "There's been talk of the ownership group offloading part of the building quietly. Nothing public yet, but they're feeling the pressure. Not enough long-term tenants." He paused, studying me. "If your client's serious, they might be open to selling partial equity in exchange for guaranteed lease commitments." I kept my face neutral, but my heart kicked. Office space, control, leverage, all hiding one floor above the people who demoted me. "I'll pass that along," I said with a slight nod. "Thank you for your time." As I walked out of the lobby, I glanced back at the brass directory, Venturon Capital, floors 6 through 9. Perfect. That night, I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I drove to the financial district's business library, a place I hadn't visited since my graduate school days. I needed somewhere quiet to think, somewhere Charles Bennett's influence couldn't reach. I found a corner table in the back section and spread out my legal pad. For the first time since my demotion, I allowed myself to think beyond survival. Not just how to endure this humiliation, but how to transform it into something powerful. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page, strategic asset assessment. Then I began listing everything Venturon thought they owned, but actually depended on me to maintain. Client relationships I'd built over 15 years, institutional knowledge about market trends, competitor weaknesses, regulatory loopholes. The trust of key players across 3 continents who called me directly, not the company. Most importantly, I had the complete architectural blueprint of how Venturon operated. Their cash flow cycles, their decision-making bottlenecks, their hidden vulnerabilities. Charles had just handed his biggest competitive threat everything she needed to destroy him. But destruction wasn't the goal. It was too crude, too obvious. What I needed was displacement. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a routine. Every morning I arrived at Venturon at 7:30, performed my menial tasks with quiet efficiency, and observed. I watched Aiden fumble through presentations using my old materials. I listened to Charles make promises to clients based on strategies he didn't understand. I noted which board members looked uncomfortable during meetings, which executives seemed frustrated with the company's new direction. At lunch, I climbed to my empty staircase and made calls. The first was to David Liu, who had been a senior partner at Venturon before retiring early to pursue other interests. Corporate speak for having enough money to escape Charles's ego. David had been my unofficial mentor during my first 5 years at the company, teaching me how to navigate the subtle politics of high-stakes finance. Sarah. His voice was warm when he answered. I heard what happened. Charles is a fool. I need advice, I said simply. Coffee tomorrow. The place on 5th Street. You remember. David looked older than I remembered, grayer, more lined around the eyes, but his gaze was still sharp. We sat in a corner booth, and I laid out my situation without emotion or complaint. Just facts. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You want to know how to beat him without declaring war, he said finally. I want to know how to become irrelevant to his success, I corrected. David smiled. Better, much better. He leaned back in his chair. Charles's weakness has always been his need to be the smartest person in the room. He surrounds himself with people who make him feel superior, which means he's systematically removed everyone who could actually challenge him or warn him when he's making mistakes. Except me. Until now. Right. But here's what he doesn't. Understand about power. It's not what you control, it's what controls you. Charles is controlled by his need for recognition, his fear of being overshadowed, his addiction to being the final authority on everything. David sipped his coffee thoughtfully. The most effective way to neutralize someone like that isn't to attack them directly. It's to make their weaknesses irrelevant. Build something that operates by different rules entirely. You're talking about starting my own firm. I'm talking about starting the firm Charles wishes he could have built, but can't, because his ego won't let him hire people smarter than him. Over the following weeks, I began reaching out to my network, carefully, quietly, without making my intentions obvious. I started with Michelle Torres, the brilliant financial analyst who had worked with me on the merger simulation models. Michelle was frustrated at Venturon. She'd been passed over for promotion twice despite being the most analytically gifted person in the building. I asked her to meet me for lunch at a restaurant across town. I'm thinking about starting something new, I told her over salad. Something focused on quality over politics, substance over hierarchy. Michelle's eyes lit up, but her voice was cautious. What kind of something? Advisory work. M&A consulting for mid-market companies that can't afford the big firms but need serious expertise. Companies that value results over brand names. That's a huge risk, Sarah. Charles has connections everywhere. He could make it very difficult for any of us to find work in this city. Only if we compete directly with him, I said. But what if we didn't? What if we focused on the market segment he ignores because it's not prestigious enough? What if we built something so fundamentally different that comparing us to Venturon would be like comparing a scalpel to a sledgehammer? Michelle was quiet for a moment. You're talking about precision over scale. I'm talking about being excellent at something specific rather than mediocre at everything. She nodded slowly. When would this hypothetical firm launch? 6 months, maybe sooner, depending on how quickly we can establish the infrastructure. We? I met her gaze directly. I can't do this alone, Michelle. I need people who understand that success isn't about politics or ego. It's about being so good at what you do that politics become irrelevant. Michelle was quiet for another long moment. Then, Can I think about it? Of course. But don't think too long. The window won't stay open forever. 3 days later, she called me. I'm in, she said simply. When do we start? That weekend, I drove back to the building where Venturon occupied floors 6 through 9. I parked across the street and stared up at the 10th floor, the empty floor, the opportunity Charles was too focused on his own domain to notice. I pulled out my phone and called Thomas Renair. Mr. Renair, this is Sarah Jensen. We spoke about office space for my client's advisory firm. Of course. Have you had a chance to discuss terms with them? We have. They're very interested in a long-term arrangement. Could we schedule a time to view the space and discuss specifics? Absolutely. How's tomorrow afternoon? Perfect. As I hung up, I looked up at Venturon's lit windows. Charles was probably still there, working late, convinced he was building an empire. He had no idea that his former star strategist was sitting in a car below him, planning to construct something that would make his empire look like a sandcastle. The irony was perfect. While he was focused on controlling the kingdom he'd built, I was preparing to make the kingdom irrelevant. Michelle had been right. It was a huge risk. But Charles had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed that humiliating me would break my confidence, make me grateful for whatever scraps he threw my way. Instead, he'd freed me from any obligation to protect his interests. And that, I was beginning to realize, might be the most valuable gift he could have given me. The 10th floor was perfect in its emptiness. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district, and a silence that felt like possibility. Thomas walked me through the space, pointing out the former conference rooms, the reception area where a failed tech startup had once dreamed of changing the world. Fiber optic infrastructure is already in place, he said, tapping the wall panels. Previous tenants spared no expense on connectivity. Your client would essentially be getting a premium build-out at a fraction of the cost. I nodded, mentally, calculating square footage against the preliminary budget Michelle and I had sketched out. What kind of timeline are we looking at for occupancy? Immediate, if terms can be agreed upon. The ownership group is motivated to move quickly. Motivated was corporate speak for desperate. Perfect. And the equity arrangement you mentioned? Thomas glanced around, then lowered his voice. Between us, they're looking at a 15% equity stake in exchange for a 5-year guaranteed lease commitment. Essentially, your client would be buying into the building's future while securing long-term space at below-market rates. I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was calculating. 15% of a building that housed some of the city's most prestigious financial firms. If property values continued their upward trajectory, that stake alone could fund our operations for years. I'll need to discuss this with my client, obviously, but the space certainly meets their requirements. That evening, I called Michelle from my apartment balcony. The city lights spread out below like a circuit board. The space is available, I told her. But I need to know you're committed before we move forward. Once we sign papers, there's no going back to the safety of a Venturon paycheck. Sarah, Michelle's voice was steady. I've been thinking about this for weeks. About what we're really building here. It's not just about leaving Venturon. It's about proving that success doesn't require playing their games. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's going to be harder than you think. 18-hour days, uncertainty, the constant pressure of building something from nothing. I know, but I also know that staying where I means accepting that mediocrity is the price of security, and I'm not willing to pay that price anymore. I smiled in the darkness. Then let's make this official. 2 weeks later, we signed the lease agreement for Jensen Torres Advisory. The name was Michelle's suggestion. No corporate jargon. No attempt to sound bigger than we were. Just our names and our promise to deliver excellence. Our first hire was Diana Chen. a compliance specialist who'd been quietly marginalized at Venturon after questioning some of Charles's more aggressive interpretations of regulatory guidelines. Diana brought something invaluable, an encyclopedic knowledge of financial regulations and an absolute unwillingness to compromise on ethics. "I heard through the grapevine that you two were starting something," Diana said during our coffee interview. "I want in." "You don't even know what we're offering yet," Michelle pointed out. Diana laughed. "I know it's not working for someone who treats compliance like an inconvenience. That's enough for me." By month's end, we had our first client inquiry, a mid-market manufacturing company looking to acquire a smaller competitor. The kind of deal Venturon would never touch because the fees weren't large enough to justify their overhead. For us, it was perfect. A chance to prove our model, nimble, thorough, and focused on the client's actual needs rather than our own prestige. The deal took 6 weeks to structure and another month to close. Our fee was a fraction of what Venturon would have charged, but our margins were higher because our overhead was lower. More importantly, we'd delivered something Venturon couldn't: personalized attention from senior-level expertise at every stage of the process. Word traveled. 3 more clients reached out within 2 weeks of our first closing. Meanwhile, 9 floors below us, I could see the lights burning late in Venturon's offices. Charles was pushing his team harder, demanding longer hours, trying to compensate through volume for what he was losing in quality. He still had no idea we existed. It was Allison who broke my heart. I'd saved her for last among my Venturon contacts, partly because our friendship made the conversation more delicate, but mostly because I knew she was the most talented strategist still working under Charles. If I could convince Allison to join us, Jensen Torres would have the analytical firepower to compete with any firm in the city. We met at our old spot, a wine bar 3 blocks from the office where we'd celebrated deals, commiserated over difficult clients, and planned our ascent through the corporate hierarchy. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now trying to convince her to abandon that hierarchy entirely. "You've lost your mind," she said after I finished explaining our vision. "Completely, utterly lost your mind." Have I? Or have I finally found it? Allison swirled her wine, not meeting my eyes. "Sarah, you were the best of us. The smartest, the most dedicated, the most successful. If Charles could do what he did to you, what do you think he'd do to the rest of us if we followed? You? He can't do anything if we're no longer dependent on his approval." "Can't he? You think this industry doesn't talk? You think clients don't remember which firms people came from? Charles has been building relationships for 30 years. We've been building them for what, 10? 15? Exactly. Which means we're not locked into his way of doing business. We can innovate where he can't." Allison finally looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before: fear. Not the healthy fear that keeps you sharp in negotiations, but the deep, paralyzing fear of losing everything you've worked to build. "I have a mortgage, Sarah. I have student loans. I have a career path that makes sense. What you're proposing is—" She paused, searching for words. "It's beautiful, but it's not realistic. It's the most realistic thing I've ever done. Building something based on actual value rather than corporate politics. And if it fails, then at least we'll have failed attempting something worthwhile." Allison shook her head. "I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't." I nodded, understanding, but disappointed. What about quietly referring clients our way? People looking for the kind of personal attention they can't get at larger firms? "Sarah." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I can't be seen as connected to whatever you're building, not professionally. Charles is paranoid enough as it is." That was when I realized the full scope of what Charles had accomplished with my demotion. He hadn't just punished me. He'd sent a message to everyone else about the cost of excellence. Be good, but not too good. Succeed, but not too visibly. Contribute, but never become irreplaceable. I understand, I said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. We finished our wine making small talk about movies and weekend plans, carefully, avoiding any mention of work or the future. When we hugged goodbye on the sidewalk, I knew it would be the last time we spoke as friends. Walking back to my car, I felt the familiar sting of isolation that had become my constant companion since the demotion. But underneath it was something else. Clarity. Allison's rejection had shown me something important about the challenge ahead. This wasn't just about building a better business. It was about building a business that could succeed despite the fear Charles had instilled in an entire generation of professionals. Fear of taking risks, fear of standing out, fear of betting on themselves. The people who would join us wouldn't be refugees from Venturon's politics. They would be individuals brave enough to believe that excellence was its own form of security. When I got home, I called Michelle. Allison said no, I told her. I'm sorry. Don't be. She helped me understand something important. We're not building an alternative to Venturon. We're building an antidote. 6 months after signing our lease, Jensen Torres Advisory had grown to 7 employees and 12 active clients. We operated with a level of efficiency that would have been impossible at a larger firm. No bureaucracy, no redundant approvals, no meetings about meetings. Just smart people solving complex problems for clients who valued results over prestige. I kept our growth intentionally measured. Every hire was deliberate, every client carefully chosen to fit our model. We could have expanded faster, taken on larger deals, made bigger headlines. But visibility was the enemy of what we were building. Charles still didn't know we existed. 3 floors below us, Venturon continued to operate exactly as it always had: big teams, bigger overhead, and an increasing reliance on reputation to compensate for declining innovation. Our invisibility was an asset I wasn't ready to surrender. Lewis Park joined us in month 7, bringing expertise in international regulatory frameworks that opened up cross-border opportunities. Like Diana and Michelle, he'd been underutilized at his previous firm, relegated to supporting roles despite having built some of the most elegant deal structures I'd ever seen. I keep waiting for the catch, he told me during his first week. The hidden bureaucracy, the office politics, the moment when this place starts feeling like everywhere else I've worked. There is no catch, I replied. The work is hard, the standards are high, and we don't tolerate anything that gets in the way of serving our clients well. That's it. Lewis laughed. That's actually scarier than bureaucracy. At least with office politics, you know the game you're playing. The game we're playing is simple. Be so good at what we do that everything else becomes irrelevant. Our reputation spread through word of mouth among mid-market executives who'd grown tired of being treated as minor clients by major firms. We became known for 3 things: thorough analysis, creative solutions, and respect for our clients' time and intelligence. More importantly, we became profitable. Not just surviving, but actually building the kind of sustainable financial foundation that could support long-term growth. I established a routine of working late on Thursdays, staying in the office until most of the building had emptied. From our conference room windows, I could see into Venturon's offices, watching the familiar choreography of corporate life playing out below. Charles still worked the latest hours, his office light the last to go dark. I wondered what he was working on with such dedication, whether he'd noticed the subtle shifts in the industry that were making firms like ours more relevant. Probably not. Charles had always been better at managing up than managing forward. He could navigate board politics and client relationships with masterful skill, but he'd never been particularly good at anticipating change. That blindness had been frustrating when I worked for him. Now it was becoming an advantage. One Thursday evening, as I was reviewing financial projections for the next quarter, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Sarah? This is Robert Kim, from the Hartwell Group Board. I knew Robert. We'd worked together on 2 deals during my Venturon years. He was one of the more thoughtful board members, someone who actually read the presentations rather than just listening to executive summaries. Robert, what can I do for you? I heard through some mutual connections that you've started your own firm. I have a situation that might be a good fit. What kind of situation? The kind that requires discretion and expertise in equal measure. Would you be available for lunch this week? I smiled, looking down at Venturon's offices. I'd be delighted. After hanging up, I stayed at the window for another hour, watching the city lights reflect off the building's glass facade. Change was coming, slowly and quietly, like water finding cracks in a foundation. Charles might not see it yet, but the industry was beginning to notice that there were alternatives to the old way of doing business. And some of those alternatives were sitting exactly 10 floors above his head. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 18 months. After my demotion, I was reviewing quarterly projections with Michelle when my assistant, Claire Matthews, our most recent hire from a boutique consulting firm, knocked on my office door. Sarah, there's someone online too who says he's calling on behalf of the Venturon Capital board. Says it's urgent. Michelle and I exchanged glances. In all the months we'd been operating 10 floors above my former employer, there had been no contact, no acknowledgement of our existence. Charles's willful blindness had been one of our greatest assets. I picked up the phone. This is Sarah Jensen. Ms. Jensen, this is Patricia Holbrook. I serve as executive assistant to the Venturon Capital Board of Directors. The board would like to request a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. The words hung in the air like smoke. Patricia's voice was professional, carefully neutral, but I could hear the tension underneath. Something had shifted. May I ask what this concerns? I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics over the phone. Would Thursday afternoon work for your schedule? I checked my calendar, though I already knew I would rearrange anything necessary. 2 o'clock? Perfect. The meeting will be held in the main conference room on the 8th floor. I believe you're familiar with the location. After hanging up, I sat in silence for a long moment. Michelle was watching me with the expression of someone who'd just watched a chess master spot a trap 3 moves ahead. What do you think they want? She asked. Nothing good, I replied. Charles doesn't call meetings unless he's lost control of something. The next 2 days crawled by. I found myself analyzing every possible scenario. Had they discovered our client list? Were they planning some kind of legal challenge? Or had something happened within Venturon that made my expertise suddenly relevant again? I spent Wednesday evening preparing for every contingency I could imagine: financial statements, client testimonials, legal documentation of our complete independence from any Venturon assets or information. If this was going to be a battle, I would be armored. Thursday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes corporate towers look like monuments to ambition rather than achievement. I dressed carefully, my sharpest suit, minimal jewelry, nothing that could be interpreted as either supplication or aggression, professional neutrality as armor. The elevator ride to the 8th floor felt surreal. The last time I'd been in this building as anything other than a tenant, I was cleaning out my desk with a box of personal items and a severance package disguised as restructuring. Now I was returning as the CEO of a competitor, however small. Patricia met me at the elevator. She was exactly as I remembered. Silver hair, shrewd eyes, the kind of executive assistant who knew more about the company's operations than most of the board members. Ms. Jensen, thank you for coming. She led me through hallways I'd once navigated daily, past offices where former colleagues worked. A few looked up as we passed. I saw recognition, curiosity, and something that might have been respect. The main conference room was exactly as I remembered. Floor-to-ceiling windows, polished mahogany table, leather chairs arranged with military precision. But the atmosphere was different. Tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm, All 15 board members were present, an unprecedented gathering for anything short of a crisis. Charles sat at the head of the table, his face carefully composed but his hands betraying nervous energy, drumming silently against the leather portfolio in front of him. "Sarah," he said, rising as I entered, "thank you for joining us." The formal politeness was jarring after 18 months of being treated as if I'd never existed. I took the seat Patricia indicated, directly across from Charles, at the foot of the table. Symbolic positioning that put me in opposition to his authority. "I have to admit, I'm curious about this meeting," I said, settling into my chair with deliberate calm. "It's been some time since we've spoken." Richard Vasquez, the board's senior member, cleared his throat. "Ms. Jensen, we'll be direct. Venturon is facing some challenges that require specialized expertise." I waited. In negotiations, the first person to elaborate usually reveals more than they intend. "Our client retention numbers have been declining for 6 consecutive quarters," continued Margaret Chen, the board's financial oversight chair. "Exit interviews consistently cite concerns about service quality and responsiveness." "Additionally," added James Morrison, "we've lost 3 major deals in the past 4 months to smaller, more agile competitors. Deals we should have won easily." The picture was becoming clear. While Jensen Torres had been growing steadily by focusing on overlooked market segments, Venturon had been hemorrhaging clients who no longer found value in their increasingly bureaucratic approach. "I'm sorry to hear about these difficulties," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure how this relates to me." Charles finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "Come now, Sarah. We're all professionals here. We know you've been active in the industry since leaving us." Leaving. As if I'd chosen to walk away from my career rather than having it surgically removed by his insecurity. "I have been building a small advisory practice." "Yes." "Small," repeated Robert Kim with a slight smile. "Your small practice closed the Meridian acquisition last month." "Meridian was a Venturon client for 8 years." "So they knew." Of course they knew. In an industry this incestuous, secrets lasted about as long as morning coffee. "Meridian needed expertise in cross-border regulatory compliance," I replied evenly. "We were able to provide that expertise more efficiently than larger firms." "Because you poached our best compliance specialist," Charles said, his careful composure finally cracking. "Diana Chen chose to join our team after being repeatedly overlooked for advancement here." I'd hardly call that poaching. The room fell silent. I could see the board members processing this information, understanding finally dawning about why they were losing talent to competitors they'd never heard of. "We'd like to propose a solution," said Elizabeth Hartwell, speaking for the first time. "Something that could be mutually beneficial." I remained silent, giving her space to elaborate. "We're prepared to offer you a return to Venturon, senior vice president level, reporting directly to the board, rather than other management. Full autonomy over strategic operations, significant equity participation, and the resources to build the kind of team you've been assembling elsewhere." The offer hung in the air like bait on a hook. Return to the security of a major firm. The prestige of the Venturon name, the resources to operate at a scale Jensen Torres couldn't match. All I had to do was surrender the independence I'd spent 18 months building. "It's a generous offer," I said finally, "but I have to ask, what's changed?" 18 months ago, my value to this organization was deemed worth approximately 30% of my previous compensation. Charles's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Nothing has changed about my capabilities or my track record," I continued. "What's changed is your need for those capabilities, which suggests that the problem isn't with individual performance, but with systemic issues that made it possible to devalue talent in the first place." "Sarah," Margaret Chen leaned forward, "we're acknowledging that mistakes were made. We're offering a chance to correct them." "Whose mistakes?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Every person in that room knew the answer, but saying it aloud would require Charles to accept responsibility for nearly destroying the company's culture in service of his own ego. "I need time to consider this," I said, standing. "It's obviously a significant decision." "Of course," said Elizabeth. "How much time do you think you'll need?" I smiled, the first genuine expression I'd allowed myself since entering the room. "I'll let you know." As I walked toward the door, Charles spoke one final time. "Sarah, don't let pride interfere with good business sense." I paused, my hand on the door handle, and turned back to face him. "Charles, pride was never the problem. Pride was what kept me here for 15 years, building value I was never properly credited for. The problem was that some people confused loyalty with ownership." I left them sitting in their polished conference room, wrestling with the reality that their crisis had been entirely self-inflicted. The elevator ride to the 10th floor felt like ascending from one world into another. When the doors opened onto our reception area, I saw our team through fresh eyes, Diana reviewing compliance documentation with meticulous attention to detail, Louis collaborating with Michelle on a complex international structure, Claire managing client communications with efficiency that would put Venturon's entire support staff to shame. This wasn't just a business we'd built. It was proof that excellence could exist without politics, that success didn't require sacrificing integrity for survival. My phone was ringing as I reached my office. The caller ID showed David Liu's number. "I heard you had an interesting meeting today," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast. Especially when it involves board-level panic. They're scared, Sarah. Really scared." "Good," I replied, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. David laughed. "Now that's the response I was hoping for. What are you going to tell them?" I looked out my window at the city below, at the web of relationships and opportunities that stretched beyond any single company's influence. "I'm going to tell them the truth. That some offers come 18 months too late." I made them wait a full week. Every day, Patricia Holbrook called with increasingly urgent requests for my decision. By Friday, Charles himself left a voicemail, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Sarah, we need an answer. The board is prepared to be very generous, but this offer won't remain open indefinitely." I let the message sit in my inbox like a small bomb, counting down to detonation. Meanwhile, Jensen Torres continued its operations with the smooth efficiency we'd perfected. 3 new client inquiries came in. Louis closed a complex regulatory approval that had been stalled for months at the client's previous firm. Diana identified a compliance issue that saved a client from a potential SEC investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were having our best week ever, while Venturon's board desperately tried to lure me back to fix problems they'd created by dismissing my value in the first place. On Friday evening, I called Patricia. "Ms. Holbrook, this is Sarah Jensen. I'd like to schedule a follow-up meeting with the board." "Excellent. Monday morning?" "Monday at 2 p.m., but I'd like to request a change of venue. The meeting should be held here at Jensen Torres Advisory." There was a pause. "I'm not sure the board would be comfortable." "Ms. Holbrook, they're asking me to make a decision that would fundamentally alter my professional future. I think it's reasonable to ask them to see what they're asking me to give up." Another pause, longer this time. "I'll need to discuss this with the board and get back to you." She called back within an hour. "Monday at 2 p.m. They'll be there." I spent the weekend preparing, but not in the way they expected. Instead of crafting arguments about why I should return to Venturon, I prepared to show them why I never needed to. Monday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the city look like a photograph of itself. I arrived early, making sure our conference room was arranged precisely. Fresh coffee, water, the quarterly reports that showed Jensen Torres's steady growth prominently displayed, but not ostentatiously so. At exactly 2 p.m., the elevator opened to reveal all 15 board members, plus Charles and Patricia. The sight of them in our reception area was surreal. These titans of industry who'd spent decades in mahogany-paneled boardrooms, now standing in our deliberately understated space. Claire greeted them with professional warmth, offering coffee, and directing them to our conference room. I watched through my office window as they took in the details: the lack of pretension, the focus on function over status, the quiet energy of people who genuinely enjoyed their work. "Impressive space," said Margaret Chen as they settled around our table. "Very efficient. We've found that efficiency improves when you eliminate unnecessary hierarchy," I replied, taking my seat at the head of the table, my table, in my conference room, in the company I'd built from nothing. Charles looked uncomfortable, his usual commanding presence diminished by being on foreign territory. "Sarah, we appreciate you agreeing to this follow-up meeting. Have you had time to consider our proposal?" "I have. But before I respond, I'd like to understand something better. What exactly do you think the problem is at Venturon?" The question caught them off guard. They'd come prepared to negotiate terms, not conduct a diagnostic session. "As we mentioned," said Richard Vasquez carefully, "client retention has become a concern. But why? What's driving clients away?" James Morrison cleared his throat. "Exit interviews suggest they're seeking more. Personalized attention." "Personalized attention from firms like this one," added Elizabeth Hartwell, gesturing around our conference room. "Exactly," I said. "So the question becomes, why can't Venturon provide personalized attention? You have more resources, more staff, more established relationships. What's preventing you from delivering what clients want?" The silence stretched, uncomfortable and long. Finally, Robert Kim spoke. "Structural issues, bureaucracy, decision-making processes that have become cumbersome." "And where do those structural issues come from?" Another silence. I could see them wrestling with the answer everyone knew, but no one wanted to say aloud. "They come from a culture that prioritizes control over results," I continued when no one else spoke. "A culture where success is seen as a threat to authority rather than an asset to be leveraged." Charles's face had gone carefully blank, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "The reason clients are leaving Venturon isn't because of market forces or competitive pressure," I said. "It's because the organization has systematically removed or marginalized the people most capable of delivering what clients actually want. Excellence, innovation, genuine expertise applied with care and attention." "We're prepared to address those cultural issues," said Margaret Chen. "Are you?" "Because addressing them would require acknowledging that the problem isn't external. It's internal, it's systemic, and it starts at the top." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the financial district. From here, I could see Venturon's building, could make out the lights in their offices. 18 months ago, I closed the largest deal in your company's history. Instead of recognition, I received demotion. Instead of increased responsibility, I received marginalization. Not because I failed, but because I succeeded in a way that made leadership uncomfortable. I turned back to face them. That decision didn't just hurt me. It sent a message to every talented person in your organization about what happens when you excel too visibly. And now you're surprised that excellent people are leaving? Charles finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You're oversimplifying?" "Am I?" "Then explain to me why Diana Chen, one of the most knowledgeable compliance experts in the industry, was passed over for promotion 3 times before joining us. Explain why Lewis Park spent 2 years doing work that should have been handled by junior associates. Explain why Michelle Torres, who's probably the best financial analyst you've ever employed, was consistently excluded from high-level strategy discussions." "We made some personnel mistakes," admitted Elizabeth Hartwell. "You made systematic cultural choices, and those choices are now threatening the survival of the company." I returned to my seat, placing my hands flat on the table. You want to know my answer to your offer? Here it is. I'm not interested in returning to an organization that would have to fundamentally change its culture to value what I bring, because if that culture changes, you won't need me. And if it doesn't change, bringing me back won't solve your problems. The room erupted in overlapping voices, protests, clarifications, attempts to salvage the negotiation. I held up a hand for silence. But, I continued, I am interested in a different kind of arrangement. They went quiet, leaning forward. Slightly. Venturon needs what we've built here. Not just my expertise, but our entire approach, our culture, our methods, the way we prioritize client value over internal politics. What are you suggesting? Asked Robert Kim. A partnership. Not an acquisition, not a merger, a genuine partnership between equals. Venturon brings its resources and market position. Jensen brings operational expertise and cultural innovation. We maintain our independence, our decision-making, authority, and our existing team structure. Charles looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. You're talking about structural integration between two separate companies. I'm talking about a model where both organizations benefit from their respective strengths without either one sacrificing what makes them effective. Margaret Chen was taking notes, her expression thoughtful. What would the financial structure look like? Equal partnership in all joint ventures, shared equity in any new initiatives, and complete autonomy for each organization to operate according to its own principles. That's not how acquisitions work, said James Morrison. This isn't an acquisition, I replied. This is recognition that the problems you're facing can't be solved by traditional corporate restructuring. They require a fundamentally different approach to how business gets done. I could see them processing this, understanding gradually that I wasn't just rejecting their offer, I was proposing an alternative that would require them to acknowledge Jensen as an equal rather than a subsidiary. We'd need to discuss this with our legal and financial teams, said Elizabeth Hartwell. Of course, but understand that this offer has the same time limitations as yours did. The market won't wait for Venturon to decide whether it's ready to innovate. As they filed out, Charles lingered behind. For a moment, we faced each other across the conference table where I'd just redefined the terms of our relationship. You've changed, he said finally. No, I replied. I've just stopped. Pretending that your limitations were mine. After they left, I stood alone in our conference room, looking out at the city where Jensen had gone from impossible dream to viable alternative to equal partner in the span of 18 months. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Leo. Heard interesting rumors about your meeting. Well played. I smiled, typing back. Game's not over yet. But I was beginning to suspect that I'd already won. The negotiations took 6 weeks. Venturon's legal team tried every angle they could think of to structure the partnership as a de facto acquisition. Our legal counsel, a brilliant woman named Sarah Kim, who specialized in complex corporate partnerships, deflected each attempt with the precision of a master fencer. They're not used to dealing with equals, she told me after a particularly contentious session. Their entire negotiation strategy assumes they hold all the leverage. Do they? Sarah smiled. Not anymore. Your client roster speaks for itself. 3 more Venturon clients have reached out to Jensen directly in the past month. Word is getting around that there's an alternative. Indeed, our phone had been ringing constantly. The corporate world is surprisingly small, and news of Venturon's boardroom crisis had spread through the usual channels. Companies that had grown frustrated with bureaucratic delays and impersonal service were suddenly very interested in our approach. More importantly, we'd proven that our model was scalable. 3 new associates had joined us, refugees from larger firms who were tired of subordinating client service to internal politics. Our quarterly revenue had grown by 40%. Meanwhile, Venturon's problems were accelerating. Two more major clients had terminated their relationships, citing concerns about responsiveness and innovation. Charles had responded by instituting longer hours and more meetings, apparently believing that working harder could compensate for working ineffectively. "He's panicking," Michelle observed during one of our weekly strategy sessions, "creating more process instead of eliminating barriers." "Classic management mistake," added Lewis. "When you don't understand the root cause of a problem, you treat the symptoms with more of what caused the problem in the first place." Diana looked up from the compliance review she was conducting. Their latest SEC filing shows they've had to write down the value of 3 client relationships this quarter. That's unprecedented. I wasn't surprised. You can't build sustainable business relationships when your culture treats client service as a cost center rather than a value driver. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning in November. Margaret Chen called me directly, bypassing the legal teams. "Sarah, we need to talk. Not about contract terms or equity structures, about reality." "I'm listening." "The board met yesterday. Emergency session. We're looking at a potential 40% revenue decline if current trends continue. Charles has submitted a restructuring plan that involves laying off 30% of our workforce." I waited for her to continue. "We can't afford to keep negotiating. Whatever partnership structure you're proposing, we need it implemented immediately. Not in 6 months, not after legal review. Now." That afternoon, I convened an emergency meeting with my core team. Michelle, Diana, Lewis, and Claire gathered in our conference room while I laid out Venturon's proposal for immediate integration. "They're offering complete operational control," I explained. "We maintain our independence, our culture, our decision-making authority. They provide capital resources and existing client relationships. In exchange, we stabilize their operations and reverse the client exodus." "What's the catch?" asked Claire, ever the skeptic. "Charles resigns as CEO. The board wants new leadership, and they want it to come from us." The room went quiet. This wasn't just a partnership anymore. It was a complete transfer of power. "They're asking you to run Venturon?" asked Michelle. "They're asking Jensen Torres to run the combined organization, all of us. Our team, our methods, our culture, scaled up to manage a $100 million operation." Lewis leaned back in his chair. "That's either the biggest opportunity we'll ever see, or a trap designed to destroy what we've built here." "Both," I replied. "The question is whether we're confident enough in our model to test it at scale." We spent the next 3 hours going through every possible scenario. The risks were substantial. We could lose the intimacy and efficiency that made us effective. We could be overwhelmed by Venturon's existing bureaucracy. We could fail spectacularly and lose everything. We'd work to build, but the opportunity was equally compelling. Proof that our approach could transform an entire industry. The chance to show that businesses could succeed by prioritizing substance over politics, client value over internal power dynamics. "I'm in," said Diana finally, "but only if we have absolute authority to restructure operations according to our principles." "Agreed," said Lewis. "No compromises on culture, no grandfathering of ineffective practices." Michelle nodded. "We've proven this works at our scale. Time to find out if it works everywhere." Claire, the youngest member of our team, spoke last. 6 months ago, I was working at a firm where I spent more time on internal politics than client work. Now I'm being asked to help redesign how an entire industry operates. How is this even real? I smiled. It's real because we made it real. One good decision at a time. The final negotiation session took place the following Monday in Venturon's boardroom, the same room where I'd been offered my old job, back on terms that assumed I needed their validation more than they needed my expertise. This time, I sat at the head of the table. "The integration terms are non-negotiable," I told the assembled board members. "Complete operational authority for Jensen Torres leadership. immediate implementation of our client service protocols, and transparent communication to all staff about the reasons for these changes. Charles was notably absent from this meeting. His resignation had been submitted the previous Friday, along with a brief statement acknowledging that new leadership was necessary for the company's future. "What about existing staff?" asked Robert Kim. "The people who've been with Venturon for years. Every position will be evaluated based on performance and cultural fit," I replied. "Good people who've been held back by bad systems will thrive under our structure. People who've succeeded, primarily through politics rather than competence, will need to adapt or find opportunities elsewhere." "And the timeline?" "Immediate. We start tomorrow." Elizabeth Hartwell signed the partnership agreement first, her signature bold and decisive. The other board members followed, each one acknowledging that they were fundamentally altering how their company would operate. As the meeting concluded, Margaret Chen approached me privately. "Sarah, can I ask you something? Off the record?" "Of course." "Why are you doing this? You could have built Jensen into a major competitor over time. Why risk everything? To save a company that treated you so poorly?" I considered the question carefully. Because this was never about revenge. It was about proving that there's a better way to do business. Destroying Venturon would have been satisfying, but ultimately pointless. Transforming it proves that change is possible anywhere. She nodded slowly. "And Charles? What happens to him?" "Charles will land somewhere. He always does. But wherever he goes, he'll find that the industry has changed, that the old ways of managing talent and serving clients are becoming obsolete. That success now requires actually valuing the people who create value." As I walked out of Venturon's building for what I knew would be the last time as an outsider, I looked up at the 10th floor where Jensen had spent 18 months, proving that excellence didn't require permission from anyone. Tomorrow, we would begin the much larger task of proving that entire organizations could change when led by people who understood that true power comes from empowering others. The revolution had been quiet, methodical, and utterly decisive. And it was just beginning. 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where Charles Bennett had once demoted me, watching our morning leadership meeting through fresh eyes. The mahogany table remained, but everything else had changed. Gone were the rigid hierarchies and territorial power plays. In their place sat a team of 12 people, some from the original Jensen group, others from Venturon's surviving talent, united by a shared commitment to excellence over politics. Michelle was presenting quarterly results with the calm, confidence that had made her invaluable from our earliest days. The numbers told a story of transformation. Client retention up 37%, new business acquisition up 52%, employee satisfaction ratings at their highest levels in company history. "The Morrison Industries deal closed yesterday," she reported. 18 months from initial contact to signature. Under the old structure, that would have taken 3 years minimum. Lewis nodded from across the table. Regulatory approval came through in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. When you have direct access to decision makers instead of working through layers of bureaucracy, everything accelerates. Diana looked up from her compliance review. "More importantly, we haven't had a single regulatory issue since the integration. When compliance is built into the process instead of treated as an afterthought, problems get prevented rather than fixed." I listened to their reports with the satisfaction of someone who had bet everything on a vision and watched it exceed, even optimistic projections. But the real measure of our success wasn't in the numbers, it was in the culture we'd built. Claire, now our Director of Client Relations, exemplified this transformation. She'd grown from a talented but underutilized analyst into a strategic leader who understood that client service wasn't a department, but a philosophy that shaped every decision. "The Hartwell Group called this morning," she reported. "They want to expand their engagement to include international acquisitions." Robert Kim specifically requested that we handle it personally rather than delegating to external counsel. Robert Kim, the same board member who had once sat in this room, desperately trying to lure me back to fix problems they'd created. Now he was a client, specifically seeking the personalized attention that had become our signature. "What's our capacity for taking on additional international work?" I asked. "We'll need to hire 2 more associates," Lewis replied. "But I have candidates in mind. Good people who are looking for exactly what we offer here." This had become our pattern: sustainable growth driven by client demand rather than arbitrary expansion targets. We hired carefully, choosing people who shared our values rather than simply filling headcount requirements. Each new team member strengthened our culture instead of diluting it. After the meeting, I walked through what had once been Venturon's executive floor. The corner office that Charles had occupied now housed our client resource center, a space where team members could access research databases, conduct video conferences, and collaborate on complex projects. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Where once a single person had hoarded authority, now an entire team shared resources. My own office was deliberately modest, large enough to be functional, small enough to stay connected to the daily operations. Through the windows, I could see the 10th floor of the building across the street, where Jensen had begun as an idea in empty office space. That floor now housed our international division, led by a brilliant strategist named Marcus Chen, who had left Goldman Sachs to join what he called the first authentic financial services firm I've ever encountered. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. 3 Venturon executives had resigned during the first month, unable to adapt to a culture that valued collaboration over competition. A handful of clients had initially been skeptical about the leadership change, requiring careful relationship management to maintain their confidence. But for every person who left, 2 others joined. Talented professionals who had been waiting their entire careers for an organization that matched their values. For every skeptical client, 3 new ones arrived through referrals from colleagues who had experienced our approach firsthand. My phone buzzed with a text from David Liu. "Lunch today? I have news." I smiled. David had become our unofficial advisor, offering strategic guidance with the wisdom of someone who had navigated these waters for decades. His perspective had been invaluable during the integration, helping us anticipate challenges and avoid pitfalls. We met at the same cafe where he had first encouraged me to think beyond revenge toward transformation. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, the satisfied expression of someone watching a long-term investment pay dividends. "The industry is talking," he said without preamble, "about the Venturon transformation, about what you've accomplished." Good talking or cautious talking? Both. The old guard is nervous. They're realizing that what you've proven here could be replicated anywhere. That clients actually prefer competence and attention to prestige and tradition. I sipped my coffee, processing this information. And the younger generation? They're inspired. 3 firms have reached out to me asking if you'd be willing to consult on cultural transformation projects, not acquisitions or partnerships, actual consulting, on how to change the way business gets done. This was unexpected. I'd been so focused on making our own transformation work that I hadn't considered the broader implications. What kind of firms? Mid-tier operations, mostly. Companies that have the resources to implement change but lack the market position to survive by reputation alone. They need to compete on substance, which means they need to figure out how to prioritize substance. The idea intrigued me. What if the approach we'd developed here could become a model for industry-wide change? What if the quiet revolution we'd started could spread beyond a single organization? "I'll consider it," I said. "But only after we've proven that this transformation is sustainable. 6 months is a good start, but I want to see 2 full years of consistent performance before we start advising others on replication." David laughed. Still thinking like a strategist. That's exactly the right approach. As we finished lunch, he handed me a business card. From Charles Bennett. I looked at the elegant cardstock. Bennett Strategic Consulting, Leadership Development and Organizational Excellence. He started his own firm? I asked. 3 months ago. Focuses on helping established companies adapt to changing market conditions. Ironically, he's positioning himself as an expert on talent retention and cultural transformation. The irony was indeed profound. Charles was now selling the expertise he had systematically undermined during his tenure at Venturon. But perhaps that was fitting. Everyone deserved the chance to learn from their mistakes and build something better. Has he reached out directly? Not yet, but I suspect he will eventually. Success has a way of making former adversaries reconsider their positions. That evening, I stayed late to review strategic plans for the coming year. Our growth trajectory was strong but sustainable. Client satisfaction remained consistently high and team morale showed no signs of the cynicism that plagued many financial services firms. At 9 p.m., I was the last person in the office, a situation that would have been impossible under the old structure, where staying late was seen as dedication rather than poor time management. Now, when I worked late, it was by choice rather than expectation, focused on strategy rather than crisis management. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakable. Sarah? This is Charles. I had wondered when this call would come. Charles, I heard about your new venture. Congratulations. Thank you. I was hoping we could talk. Not about business exactly. More about understanding. Understanding. What? How you did it. The transformation at Venturon. The culture change. The results you've achieved. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the city lights. What do you want to understand specifically? I've been thinking about our last conversation, about what you said regarding culture and leadership. I think I'm beginning to see what I missed. There was something different in his voice, less of the aggressive confidence that had defined our previous interactions, more of the uncertainty that comes with genuine self-reflection. What did you miss? That leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about creating conditions where the smartest people in the room can do their best work. The admission surprised me with its directness. Charles had never been someone who acknowledged mistakes easily. That's part of it, I agreed. What else? That talent isn't a threat to be managed. It's an asset to be leveraged. When I demoted you, I thought I was protecting my position. Instead, I was undermining the foundation of everything we'd built. We talked for another 20 minutes, a conversation that would have been impossible 18 months earlier. Charles asked thoughtful questions about decision-making structures, about how we'd maintained quality while scaling operations, about the specific practices that had transformed Venturon's culture. Can I ask you something? He said as our conversation wound down. Of course. Do you think what you've built there could work anywhere? Or does it require specific conditions? It requires leaders who are secure enough to prioritize results over control. Beyond that, I think the principles are universal. People want to do excellent work. They want to serve clients well. They want to be part of something meaningful. The question is whether leadership creates conditions that support those desires or obstacles that frustrate them. And if someone wanted to learn how to create those conditions, I smiled. I'd suggest they start by asking their best people what gets in the way of their best work. Then listen to the answers without getting defensive. Then actually address the obstacles that get identified. It sounds simple. The concepts are simple. The execution requires constant attention and the willingness to change systems that benefit leadership at the expense of effectiveness. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet office, reflecting on how completely the dynamics had shifted. Through 18. Months ago, Charles had held all the formal power while I struggled to maintain dignity in the face of systemic humiliation. Now he was calling me for advice on how to build what I had already proven possible. The transformation was complete, but not in the way I had originally envisioned. This wasn't about defeating Charles or destroying Venturon. It was about demonstrating that businesses could succeed by different principles. Principles that honored talent, prioritized clients, and created value through collaboration rather than competition. My laptop chimed with an email from Margaret Chen. Board meeting next week. Quarterly review and strategic planning for next year. Looking forward to your presentation. Margaret, who had once been part of the desperate boardroom intervention, trying to lure me back, was now a genuine partner in shaping our organization's future. The power dynamic had shifted not through confrontation, but through consistent demonstration of a better approach. I gathered my materials and prepared to leave, but paused for a moment at the window overlooking the financial district. Somewhere, in those lit offices, talented people were struggling with the same frustrations I had once faced: being undervalued, being constrained by politics, being prevented from doing their best work by systems that prioritized control over results. Some of them would find their way to organizations like ours. Others would start their own ventures, proving that transformation was possible anywhere people had the courage to prioritize substance over politics. The quiet revolution was no longer confined to a single company or even a single industry. It was becoming a movement, spreading through networks of professionals who had experienced what was possible when excellence was actually valued, rather than merely claimed. As I turned off the lights and headed for the elevator, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something that extends beyond personal success. We had proven that organizations could change, that industries could evolve, and that quiet persistence could accomplish what loud confrontation never could. The revolution would continue, one good decision at a time, until treating talent as an asset rather than a threat became the standard rather than the exception. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that this approach could work at even greater scale. But tonight, I was content with the knowledge that we had transformed not just a company, but an entire conception of what leadership could be. The silence of my victory spoke louder than any celebration ever could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.